Before we start, in a way, I don't know, I wanted to say something about making a film because I find that it's getting more interesting. I had no idea it would be this drawn out or it would be this comprehensive. And what you're forcing me to do is to focus on different parts of my life and different activities that I've been engaged in. And it's hopefully not just a nostalgia trip, but it is a rather strange thing for me because it's not something that I've done a lot of. I have seen my life more in terms of the music I've produced. And although you might say, well, there are all these different things I do, like, there's the work with the piano and there's places like Africa and other places in the world. And then, there are times when I spent the time, nearly all my waking hours, learning the koto. And so there's all these different kinds of bits. And it sounds on the surface like I'm a bit of a gadfly going from one thing to the other. But it's never seemed at all like that, quite the contrary. And I tell you, for one reason, is that every activity was guided by the same question. And it's a question about how do we compose music in the world today? And that question can't be answered unless we have some idea about what the world is today. It's not the same as any other day. And to have some idea about what is music? What does it do? What can it do? What is its role? What is its potential? And it was a frantic way of answering these and other questions that have led me into these other activities. I had wanted to study music as far back as I could remember, at least from the age of 7 or 8. And in my sort of childish and very naive way, I knew that I knew very little about music. For example, I might have played pieces by Beethoven, but what did I know about Beethoven? Nothing. So the question was, I must try to educate myself. I went to the library and I brought out Thayer's biography of Beethoven. It's one of the earliest, and it's tried to get together every known fact about Beethoven. There are millions of them. I read it, and I read it again. Immediately, I started from page 1 on volume 1. And when I got to the end, it was a complete revelation to me because I thought the extraordinary thing is, I know more about this man than I know about any human being I've met. I know more about him than I know about my parents. It would be difficult to meet anybody in life that I could know this much about. And it wasn't only just facts about their life, but their inner life through his work as a composer, that gave me a kind of door into an imaginative world of which I had no inkling. And it was extraordinary to me. I was really bowled over. It was a turning point that this could happen. And it went along with my exploring Beethoven's works. I mean, first I thought, yes, I must get to know a symphony or two. How can you know one symphony or two of Beethoven? You've got to know them all. And yet they don't make sense if you don't know all the concertos and the string quartets. This is a vast task. But I was very interested in getting to know, to having that experience and then there's a question arises, what does it mean to get to know a piece of music? What does it mean to say, I know it? Well, for me, it was quite clear. You knew it because you knew what was coming next, and you knew many different kinds of relationships. Of course, you can never completely know it, but you were familiar with it like you were familiar with a friend. They weren't strangers to you. So the first problem is, how do you get from being a complete outsider to being on intimate terms? The Beethoven also taught me that you can't understand a person or body of work without knowing something about where they lived, what kind of society, what kind of beliefs they had, not only as an individual, but as part of that society, part of that history. So history and social understanding are just as important as individual understanding. They make a very rich mix. But I was interested in new music, and I remember, again, I must have been only 17 or something like that, going into a record store in London where I had been told they had records at everything. I went up to the man behind the counter and I said, look, what is the most modern of all the modern pieces that you've got? The really thing that's really out there at the cutting edge, because that's what I want. And he went and handed me over Schoenberg, a record of Schoenberg, Pierrot Lunaire. I had not come across Schoenberg. I went home and I played it, and it was completely incomprehensible to me. I couldn't understand why music should be made like that. So I got a book. I got a book about Schoenberg, and I also got Schoenberg's writings. I was immensely impressed by these. They were terrifically inspiring. So the question that I had then was, okay, here's a very intelligent and a man full of incredible integrity and intellectual power. Why should he write music like this? Why does he think that this music is important to write, is intelligible, and on what level is it intelligible, and why isn't it intelligible to me? That was the problem that I had. So the answer that I could only come up with is, yes, it must be intelligible, and I need to learn why. And I can only learn why by learning to play such music and learning to listen to such music. So I decided that I would play the first, the Pierrot Lunaire is in 21 movements. I would play movement 1 10 times before breakfast. And I did that for a week, and then I moved on to movement 2. And in the process of this, I more or less wore the disc out. I was quite clear, even at this early stage, that you could get to know a piece and play it well, and that listening was detailed, focused listening was really important. But so was playing. There was a dual approach that was needed. So when later on I got involved in, say, Indian music or music from outside the tradition, it was the same motivation. Now, why I'm saying this at this moment is that this desire to learn, to absorb something, to make it your own, to really come to terms with it and become intimate with it, has been almost an obsession. I mean, it's something that I've done my whole life. So that, when I got interested in ethnomusicology, it was to find out answers to these questions, to absorb the music that I found very alien or difficult or was always an outsider to. I wanted to be an insider. I didn't want to be an outsider. So this is what took me to these places. But the end result was to become familiar with music, to broaden out, to see what music could do, what questions were asked, what was demanded of it, and why these questions differed at different times in different places, and they're utterly different. I mean, even within European history, the questions that have been asked of art and of music have just changed radically from period to period. And I was interested I'm thinking how that any significant artist must be somebody who has asked a new question, has demanded something new of the music. That's why the answers are incomprehensible in terms of the old questions. And well-meaning people sit there and think, I can't make head nor tail of this. It is just, I don't know why it's like it is. because they do not know the question that has been asked, and they can't assimilate it and put it together so it makes an experience and it's not just an intellectual understanding. So this is what binds everything together, all these different activities. Because to be a composer, these answers seem to be absolutely necessary. I started to play the piano at a very young age. It was a way of exploring music. If I wanted to know what a piece sounded like, I would sort of play it on the piano. And that has become something that I do all the time. I want to know about particular pieces. I want to absorb them. And sometimes you only can get so far by listening and repeated listening. But by playing, you get another insight. My mother noticed that when I was going to sleep at night, she put me to bed and say good night. And then I would sort of launch into singing hymns and folk songs and anything that took my fancy at the top of my voice while lying down in bed. Why I did this, I have no idea, but it suggested to her that I might be musical. And then she saw there were scholarships to go to the Cathedral Choir School in Canterbury. And she thought, well, maybe this would be a way out of our predicament of not having much money. And she thought this would be a wonderful opportunity to have a decent education. Little did she know. There was a school, there were 52 boys in the school, that's all. And our principal duty was providing music for the cathedral. That was the reason why we were there. The rest of our education was because we had to be educated and was of secondary concern. But quite separate from that was working in the choir, which was very strict. We were treated like professionals. We had punishments for singing wrong notes, and certainly of not behaving in a proper way. And we had to do this with absolute professionalism twice a day, 3 times on Sunday, with all the rehearsal that it took. That old Gothic cathedral where all kinds of incredible things had happened and a history one could hardly imagine was in a way ever present. And the building has such a strong atmosphere, and especially had an atmosphere at that time before there were so many electric lights, and the candle light was still used for quite a lot of things. It was a vast and strange and a place full of ghosts. There was a moment at Canterbury when I suddenly came to me. I knew what I wanted to do with my life. I must have been perhaps 10. We were lined up one day by the headmaster, and he said, "Yes, boys, I brought you here because something I want you to consider. No doubt from time to time you talk with your parents about your prospective career and journey in life, and it's quite right that you should start to bear that in mind from now. But of course I realize that you do a great deal of music, your life is dominated by music, but I don't want any of you to get the silly idea into your head that you're going to be musicians just because of that." He said that, I thought, that's it! That's it! I had never thought of this before. That's what I am going to do. It was that moment. It was absolutely like a light came on. I knew that was it for me. So it was strange that from the sort of absolute moment, I'd never wanted to do anything else. I went to the Wigmore once, and for a concert presumably, and I was looking around what concerts were on. And I see in 1 month, over 20 pianists giving their recitals or looking down the programs. The most difficult music ever written. Liszt Sonata and the Brahms Paganini variations and, everything. And I thought, well, this is too much. Who needs this amount of pianists? And I thought, I'm never going to have a technique like Horowitz or Rubinstein, who were my gods at the time, absolutely. And there's all these other people doing it as well. But when it comes to composition, if I don't write this piece of music, it doesn't get written. It was coming to me more and more that the world was a big place. And there were all kinds of other cultures and other places that I knew nothing about. And some of them had enormous musical traditions. And why had nobody told me about them? Not a word was breathed about it, especially Indian music, which was the first to impinge in a big way because Indian musicians started coming. And at one point I thought, why not travel to India? I said this to a colleague of mine. Why, we have got the summer holidays coming up. Why not take a look for ourselves? And then we decided we wouldn't go by air because it would be too sudden. And we would understand more, we'd be able to absorb things more if we went through gradual stages. So we went by local buses. We got on a bus and we just got to the next village or the next town. And we got on another bus. It was without any plan other than that. We were searching out musicians in Iran, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, until we came to India. That was our introduction to India. And then in India, we traveled all over, meeting musicians everywhere that we went. As a composer, I was very excited to hear these different things and to meet these musicians. And I thought, oh, it's wonderful, But how can I share my music with them? That was the big problem. There's something wrong. If somebody doesn't come from a highly educated few centers of Europe and America and is particularly interested in this kind of music, I have nothing to share. I can't get into it. And yet I'm sharing their music all the time. And I thought, this is a serious problem that I need to work out. I became conscious of the fact that despite having all this education in music, I was unable to really understand what was happening in this music. And I needed I needed a different kind of education. And that's why it was from there that I decided to go to Wesleyan and study ethnomusicology specifically, because whatever I had been taught, it didn't lay a foundation for what I needed. tambourine is coming. It started off as a flute solo over a drone, and the influence of that was directly from Indian music. And then at a certain point, I thought, this Indian influence is too much of a weight on my shoulder. What happens if you cut out the drone? Well, without the drone, something else happens. So I thought, well, the other thing is that you have changing pedal notes rather than a continual drone. The drone changes. Actually, it was the relationship between two kotos in koto duets in the koto repertoire that made me think, oh yes, there's something of that. It's a kind of two versions of the same melody, a sort of heterophony, but where one is constantly having ornaments and the other has different ornaments, and one falls behind the other and then takes it over. It's not like counterpoint, because they're covering the same ranges and crisscrossing each other all the time. When I wrote After the Rain, and it has three ocarina players, 7 ocarinas. And that was because the shakuhachi, which I was principally writing for, I wanted something that would support the shakuhachi. Now, the shakuhachi has an enormous dynamic range. It's enormous. But it's not, compared to a symphony orchestra at its loudest, it's not nearly as loud. But you can take it down and down and down, and even though you're sitting next to the player, you can hardly hear where it disappears. And when it's forceful, it's really forceful. But the middle of the dynamic range is much lower than any commercially made instrument. So the question is, what would go with it? And it almost cut out any bought instrument that was known. And the ocarina has the same dynamic area. And so that's why one of the reasons why it could support it. From the beginning, I was not interested in copying a sound and saying, oh, this is an exotic sound, let's sort of see if we can copy that. Either boring way, because you can only do a second-hand, watered-down version that's never going to be as good as the original. I mean, it was hopeless. So that never interested me at all. I was always interested in what happens if you absorb these influences and they mix with everything else you have going on, and that takes time and it's unconscious. And then whatever comes out, it will be what comes out.
In modern societies, we have more instruments surrounding us than perhaps any other society before us. Different traditions jostle side by side, traditions that previously were cultivated by different classes or in different parts of the world now coexist. Under these circumstances, it would seem unnatural not to take advantage of the enormous potential and the enormous range of instruments that are available on our doorstep. I don't think that it is unnatural to do this. I think composers have always done it. I think of Beethoven writing pieces like the Ninth Symphony, in which he took Turkish instruments, which were in Vienna at the time introduced by mercenary soldiers who had been brought in to fight Napoleon, and they had brought their own instruments with them, and he found it perfectly natural to incorporate them into his own works. I don't think I'm doing anything other than following that august example.
when I listened to Japanese music, I couldn't possibly understand the relationship between the instruments and why it was like that. And I thought, somehow, however much I listen to this music, I'll never understand it unless I get my fingers on it, unless I actually play it. And on that basis, and that was probably the only opportunity I would have in my life to understand this quite extensive body of music, I chose Japanese music. And then it so happened that my neighbor was Yoshikazu Iwamoto. And very important that was, because, with music, it's the one-to-one relationship that is formed, that is so essential. In most traditions, the essential core transmission is through one-to-one contact. So having musicians there, and was one of the reasons why, as soon as I got to Dartington much later, I wanted to have musicians there, and we started a little Japanese program of our own. When I met Yoshikazu, or when I got to know the shakuhachi better, it struck me that a lot of the things that I was trying to do, the instrument already did them. And not only did them, but did a million and one other things. And it also came to me that this solved the other problem, is you can modify the instrument, but it's much harder to modify the player. And the players bring so many restrictions to instruments because of the way they've been trained, how they conceive of music, what they think is right and what they think is wrong, that these are a mindset which in some cases is almost impossible to crack into and modify. But many of those things are different when you go to a completely different culture with a different background. There's a different mindset. It's just as rigid perhaps, but it's different. And many of the things that Western musicians could do, Yoshikazu couldn't, but many of the things that he could do, they couldn't do. And I remember when we were recording the first recording that we did in the Royal College, we were in the middle of recording some of my music, and there was a composer hovering around who wanted to come out and listened in the control box. And we had a little break, and he said to Yoshikazu, he said, "Oh, there's wonderful little glissandi you do. He says, so elegant. How do you do that?" And Yoshikazu, as he could, looked at him straight in the eye and said, "No, it's just practice." And the guy, his expression said, "Oh God, practice, well, forget it then." And it was clearly they thought it was some kind of trick that he could take home and do all these wonderful things, or that it was somehow built into the instrument and the player didn't do it, and the player was kind of naive and simple, which we often project onto players of music that we're unfamiliar with. We think we don't give them the credit for having gone through years and years of trying and practicing and developing their skills. Some things is instinctive, or it's automatic, or it's in the instrument. You can't fail to do it. And we denigrate them in that way, of course. my composing life just sort of goes on regardless of what I'm doing. So in Wesleyan, I'm studying ethnomusicology, but I'm studying ethnomusicology very much from the point of view of a composer. I'm learning the koto madly, not because I ever think I'm going to be a great virtuoso on the koto, but because I want to understand the music. And this is the quickest way to do that. And now I'm being an ethnomusicologist in Africa. But again, I'm still a composer. I'm writing music on my own. It's a separate life altogether. But it's being informed by the understanding that I'm getting of this completely different kind of music in a completely different situation. When I came back from doing my PhD in Wesleyan, I thought basically I'm unemployable. There's very little ethnomusicology that goes on in British universities. It was impossible. I was looking around for a job anywhere. I went to Kenya, but I knew nothing about it. And so I set off and I basically traveled all around Kenya, north, south, east, and west. And I've been going for weeks on end. Well, there are people who live on the coast. They're very interesting because I had all this Arab influence from Oman in particular. And there are people who have never been in contact with any road system and they live completely isolated lives. And there's people who have had the road and things have come up and they've made a culture that's integrated with influences from outside and things from inside. And wherever you go, there are really dozens and dozens of different kinds of cultures in Kenya. And they're all musically interesting in themselves for their special situation. And I thought there's no reason to be one place rather than another. I'll stay where I am now. And I happen to be amongst the Pokot in northwestern Kenya. Very isolated place. And I decided then on the spot, okay, I'll draw on the map 50 square kilometers. This is my area. Privately, I'm just me as a composer. And I'm trying to find out about this. How is music working in these societies? How does it work in a very traditional society in Africa? And how could that be compared to how it works in my society? What has it got to tell me about this? How can I put the two together and compare them? For instance, I was very interested to know how people thought about contemporary music. And did they make a division between contemporary music and traditional music? I mean, I say that, but of course, the first thing one has to learn is that one's first questions are unintelligible to the people you're putting the questions to. They just don't think in those terms, and it's a stupid question, basically, a non-question. But this isn't, because yes, I thought there'd just be kind of one kind of music, but in this small group, this small 50 square miles of a completely self-contained pastoralist culture, there were, at my last count, 34, 35 different genres of music. It was a society like most societies were pre-industrially, where the loudest sound you heard was going to be made by a human being outside a clap of thunder or something like that. In this, in this environment, you imposed on the silence. Music was absolutely necessary in some senses to make an event separate from the usual kind of silence. About half a mile away from Koloa, Tongong lived. So somebody said, "Oh, there's this musician here." So I'll go find this, and I found this very remarkable old man who played the lyre and didn't look like everybody else, with a white beard, and was very lively and interesting, and said he did these songs, but we were on our way back and we didn't really have time. And I remember I said to Tongong, "Oh, I'd like to talk to you some more, and I'd like to hear your music, but I can't now because we've got to go back. When are you free?" And I remember very distinctly he answered. He said, "Oh, come anytime. Yes, any time, any month, any year, because I'm not going anywhere." It took me quite a few months to rearrange things so I could, because it wasn't a simple place to get to find him again and start my work with him. And it turned out to be, I worked more with him than any other single musician. And actually, at one time, I brought him to Nairobi for a few weeks and arranged things for the television and the radio for him. And it was all very, very remarkable, because I discovered that he has a repertoire of songs that is completely different to any other lyre player. Oh, a lot of young men played the lyre. Well, not a lot, but a scattering of lyre players, and they all had half a dozen songs that they would sing, usually with their friends, and they were sort of communal singing. Tongong's songs, I discovered, were completely different from that. His vocal style was so complicated that the idea of that other people could join in was out of the question, as well as the lengths of the lines and how things went together. It was just too complicated to be a communal song. And then I discovered that he sang these songs to his friends and neighbors. and they were songs about things that concerned the Pekot, or amazing events that had happened, or memorable things, or shaming things. And there was this vast body of songs.
Mapore turi kajuja, iyoi, oh mapore turi kalewa dingwangwang, mombaji, rasa mombaji kongenyu Yesu nyengurienge we, idone ye. I bet you get the woman, no meeting it, no good day. Don't oh, my boy, Turiga Junja. Mombaji, oh, my boy, Turiga, I was in one. Don't.
You know, so many people have the idea that African music is all communal. It's all to do with dance and ceremonies, and it's not. This is a stereotype. And Tongong's music was definitely solo music for him to tell his stories and his songs to his close neighbours. And what is important to them and is not at all the same as what strangers from the outside who come in think are important. It's an entirely different set of values. So you're getting a picture. If you have enough song text from one place, you can get a wonderful picture of what it's like to really be of that society rather than observe it sensitively. And I think some of the song texts themselves should really be preserved as a national archive, because these ways of life are dying out as we speak. Every moment of every day, traditional societies are collapsing, and in immense amounts of knowledge and history, and it's all being lost. But the song texts, therefore, are not just trivial. They're really very, very important documents, because it's the only inside view we have often of non-literate societies.
Nairobi.
these figures, no, between these figures are sounds, linked sounds. Some sounds are words. Repeat. Some sounds are words. Repeat. Some sounds occasionally, perhaps, sounds are gates. Gates. Open or shut. Oddly intermittent. I suddenly woke up in the middle of the night and thought, oh yes, I'd like to do a piece called Screens. I knew the title, and I knew that I wanted 3 or 4 screens, and that players would come from behind them and disappear, and that this would be like a subtle kind of mute. In the performance, because we had the screens at the last minute, it didn't work as much as I would have liked in that respect, and I would like to experiment with different material behind the screens, or perhaps going behind the screens and playing with their back to the audience. I was clear also that I wanted the combination of the Jaltarang and the Indian Santur. And I knew they have nothing to do with the screens. They have their backs to the audience, facing the other players in center stage. I don't know how I knew this. I just knew this, and I didn't question it. I was interested in their tuning. I like both the instruments because you can change the tuning very subtly and it stays where it's put. I think of my pieces not as theatre. It's not theatre. It's concert music. But a concert is in a theatre. And how the musicians are dressed, how they behave on the stage, how they bow, everything that they do, how they pick up their instruments, their body language. This communicates something very important. And you can't opt out for it saying, this doesn't matter. I'll just come on in my everyday clothes and I'll slouch in my chair. And well, slouch in your chair means something. Coming in your everyday clothes means something. So it's to actually take this on as an inherent part of the piece. These elements become important. Whether a musician plays on a slightly raised above the stage on a dais makes a hell of a lot of difference to how the audience react. Every gesture of the bow on a stringed instrument, what you're doing when you're not playing a note, what you're doing in the silences, these affect those silences profoundly. So it's from a compositional point of view, it's just my attempt to try and make this part of the composition, to integrate it, to think about it. The words occur just like everything occurs in my piece, because I'm not really very conscious of the implications. I'm asking my instinct what I need at any particular time. I work by instinct. And sometimes I can't put words or ideas to it. It's like moving towards something that is ephemeral. As soon as you go to touch it, it disappears. But I'm trying to make it real. It's like writing down a dream almost. And you can't quite get the details, but you have an instinct that is right and that is not right. That is all of it for me. I don't have any other meanings. What does this piece need now? Does he need to repeat a phrase? Does he need to go on the same way? Does he need something new to happen? Anyway, I got to a position when I was stuck. And I knew that, unlike most of my pieces, time was running out. There was the concert it was needed for. That is a very unusual situation for me, and I don't like it, because usually it takes time to answer these questions. But I know that I need something that's not been in the piece, and it's another dimension to take your attention quite away from how you think the thing is laid out, to offer up another perspective. I mean, I sit down with a piece of paper and the words came, and some of the words were pretty naff, and other words seemed to be all right, and gradually I worked on them, more or less cutting down and cutting down and cutting down. For instance, I think I originally had words something like this: some sounds are entrances. Entrances. No. Some sounds are doors. No. And then gates. Gates to gardens. Gates to places. I thought, okay, there's a kind of openness about this. I can work with gates. goes on. Yes, that was from the ceremony for the eclipse of the sun that was recorded in Koloa in February 1980. I was in the area. I had no idea there was going to be an eclipse, and certainly Pokot had no idea there was going to be an eclipse. I have been working steadily on the music for some time. I mean, a couple of years or so by then, and I thought I more or less had sussed out the various genres. Music associated with rituals. There was music that had to be contemporary. It was about something that happened last week. And there was music for people who had twins, and music for women, and music for men, and music for young boys, and music you had to compose yourself, and music that was played to you by other people. There's music for dancing, and music that you had to sit and listen to. There were all these kind of different kinds of music, and no member of the society knew all of them. And then suddenly this eclipse arrives. And not only do I find there's a kind of repertoire that I know nothing about, but there's suddenly a drum, as you could hear in the recording. And I would have bet my house on my knowledge that the Pokot don't have drums of any kind. But where did this drum come from suddenly? And on this occasion, where did this other body of songs come from? Well, it turns out that one of a sub-clan, where the Pokot, their families are divided into clans, and of course you can't marry somebody within your clan, and each clan is designated by an ancestor who they think they're related to. So you might have the Buffalo clan. This is a practical application, because if you're out with your friends and you are confronted by a buffalo, the first thing is to run away. But if you have a member of the Buffalo clan with you, you won't run away. You say, oh, well, he's one of your relatives. Just tell him we're your friends, and please let us pass. And the Buffalo clan man will try and do the needy. Anyway, there's an eclipse of the sun subclan who keep this knowledge of the songs. But where did the drum come from? And I mean, you can't have a drum. I would have noticed it. I've been in and out of people's houses all this time. Nobody had ever mentioned a drum. Well, the answer was that the rest of the time, in ordinary everyday life, it had been a honey pot. And had been perfectly sort of efficient as a honey pot. It's only at eclipse of the suns that honey pots turn into drums. And there's a certain beating, as you also heard, of hide with sticks, mainly by women, who there are two or three who know the songs, and everybody else learns them in next to no time, because there's a lot of repetition. It's easy to learn them. And the idea of these songs is to curse the eclipse of the sun and its evil influences. It's altogether evil. It makes the sun go dark, and the strange atmosphere is very, very evil for the Pokot. So you must curse it and chase it away and tell it to go somewhere else. And you do that by beating on the skin and beating on the drum and singing these songs. And if you keep on at it, it has the desired effect, because the eclipse goes away. In this piece, the fish that became the sun, there's a large number of instruments that are especially made for the piece or found from strange sources. The one thing they have in common that binds them all together, as it were, is the fact that everything comes from refuse. Musical instruments have been abandoned because all the stuff is stuff that could have been or was thrown away. When things are thrown away on a rubbish dump, they decay, they're separated off, become parts of something larger, and as such, they can enter into unusual alliances. They find themselves cheek by jowl with the most unexpected neighbours, and a new life starts at that moment of new alliances. The piece actually involves almost 40 musicians, both singers and instrumentalists. And there are many, many more instruments than these. Some of them are specially made, like these. Others are conventional instruments. The ensemble involves, in the conventional instrument line, 3 double basses, a contrabassoon, solo violin, and a harmonium. And amongst the singers, there are 3 male singers who often use the eunuch flutes, and 4 female singers. And towards the end of the piece, really outside, come 8 cornets, a special sound wall. I've always been attracted by simple things that were then invested with a great deal of skill and energy and time to transfigure them and to transform them into a world one could hardly dream of. In most of the conversations or the thoughts about Beethoven, we're not primarily talking about Beethoven as a man who was born in 1770 and died in 1827. We're talking about an experience, and we don't have words for that experience, and it's quite different from other experiences. So in order to focus the attention and grasp what we're trying to communicate, we call that experience Beethoven. And everybody's experiences knows exactly what it is. It's a kind of shorthand So it's not a person that we're always referring to, it's an experience. And later on, when I started traveling and looking at other societies, I realized the same thing is true. Africa is a continent, but it's also an inner place that all human beings have. And music is a kind of way of negotiating both the inner reality and the outer reality. That is not something fixed, but something that is always being renegotiated. You know, we are completely dyed-in-the-wool believers that the only reason to learn an instrument is to play it for somebody else. Learn music is to perform. And this has sort of really got hold of us as a culture in a terrible way. This is one of the things I was very interested in learning Japanese music. That performance isn't the end, isn't the goal. Learning is the goal. When learning the koto in Japan, you become part of a group of other people learning. And you have a very, very precisely drawn but changing relationship with that whole group, with other students, with your teacher, with your teacher's teacher, and going back even further than that sometimes. So that the group is terrifically self-supportive, and that is an end. It may be that one or two odd, peculiar characters want to take that music and perform it in public to a crowd of people who applaud. But whether they do or not is neither here nor there. That's just a quirk. It's not the purpose of why you're doing it. And many of the people do not do that who are really fantastic performers. And that was, I think, very important to me to realize that, you know, it's the doing, it's the absorbing of the music, of making it part of our fabric that is the important thing. How we do that, whether it's listening, playing, thinking, studying, whatever. It's not a personal journey. Although it seems that way, you know, when one's trying to find a way forward, it's not a personal journey. It's a journey of our time that is shared in many different ways by other people. And one of the aspects, but only one of the aspects of this journey is how do we live in a global world, and the breakdown of these individual cultural areas that we all identify with and have such power over our personalities. The gradual decaying of these, that we learn more and more about each other and realize that this is really only one story. There's only one history, and not histories. There's a history of humankind. And we all share it, and we all have a little gateway into it maybe through our individual cultures. But we're learning about each other, and this is coming together as one history very, very fast. As I said before, different questions were asked at different periods of history, and different cultures asked different questions. So what is the sum total of these questions? What is it that we would know about music as a whole, as something that has infected human society, all human societies, without exception as far as we know? What would be the totality of those questions, and is that the limit? Well, that's why I was interested in new things. I couldn't think that it was the limit. So one of our goals as a composer, I thought, should be to ask new questions, still ask new questions, because maybe human civilization is only at the beginning. After all, 3000 BC is the beginning of recorded history as through writing, and that's not very long ago. As the history of the earth is. So maybe human beings could be that we're just an anomaly and will die out and never be thought of again. Or it may be that we're at the beginning of a much longer story and we're only sort of toddlers at the moment. Therefore, to think that all the questions now have possibly have been asked, is foolish. And yet to ask a new question is a very difficult task to set oneself. If you think of how to spend your life, there are a million problems in the world, and it's not difficult to think of places where you could be of real help. And yet all over the world there are people who say, no, I want to blow this air down this tube to make this noise. Or I want to scrape this string. That is more important to me. That is what I'm going to do. It's insane. And yet, perhaps not, because what they're saying is that although I can't articulate it, there is something that means more to me, that is more urgent, that is compelling me to do this. And that's what, we have to take seriously, as this impulse within us to have these sounds.